Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, so. All right.
She didn't realize that moment she's gonna make a
Oh my
meme that
gosh,
goes.
it's hilarious. It is like that's 95% of my feed now, and I love it. So it's hilarious. But anyway, all right, we're gonna be in John 18. So yeah, we didn't mention it, but remember Max and Mary. The funeral is today for Max's son. So just keep them in your prayers. And then Grace's due date is tomorrow, so pray that she will go into labor on her own. She's not wanting to be induced, but the doctor, of course, is saying if it goes too much further past that, they probably will. So.
Y'all remember me? I had to go back to the orthopedic, and she asked me how I was doing, and I said it's still swelling and all this stuff. They did another X-ray. My arm has not healed at
What?
all.
Wow.
No.
At all.
Always.
Do they say why? Like, what's the purpose? That's crazy.
She's trying to get me a bone stimulator from the insurance company,
That's just crazy.
but it's not moved. It's not changed.
All that you did.
Wow.
Wow. Pineapple and protein.
That's what my husband told me this morning about
Pineapple and protein. Pineapple will help heal the bones, and the protein will also help with that. I use Premier Protein shakes.
I thought you were taking calcium since you hurt your back. You take calcium. Okay, take a 1200.
All right, so we're gonna kind of go back over. We're not gonna focus on Peter today. We're gonna focus on the part about Jesus, but we're gonna read some of the same verses. So John 18:19 through 22, it says, "Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. Jesus replied, 'Everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple, where the people gather. I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said.' Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. 'Is that the way to answer the high priest?' he demanded. Jesus replied, 'If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me?' Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest." I have my phone on. No, I don't want to read, so So John, we talked about, he keeps pointing out these ironies that are going on, right? And we're going to talk about a lot of those today. But he's emphasizing here that Annas is not really searching for the truth. They're searching for the evidence to justify what they've already decided, right? They've already decided that Jesus has to die. Now they're just trying to justify it. This is one of the clearest places where Jesus exposes that this is an illegal trial. Okay, because what does Jesus say when he says, "What have you been teaching?" Jesus replies, "Look, everybody knows what I teach. I have not spoken in speaker. Why are you asking me this? Ask those who heard me." And so he's actually telling them the law says that you have to have witnesses against me. Where are my witnesses, right? Where are the people who are testifying against me? So Jesus did never protest his innocence. He never says, "I'm innocent of what you're accusing me of." He doesn't say that. He actually insists that the court follow its own standards of justice. He says, "Why are you asking me?" He's not being evasive. He's reminding them how a lawful hearing should take place, right? Legally, this, if you go back to the book of Moses, we're talking about the Jewish legal system, because right now he's not before Rome, he's before Jews, right? He's before the high priest. And so he's calling them to say, what does your law say about how this should be handled? You're not doing it that way, right? According to Jewish legal principles in the Old Testament and rabbinic tradition, the testimony of witnesses came first. So according to Deuteronomy 17 and 19, you cannot convict a person just on accusation. That's a good thing, right? Because people lie, right? People make false accusations. So in the Old Testament, God had established that if someone is accused of a crime, there has to be witnesses to corroborate that crime, right? We still kind of follow this today in our judicial system, right? You have to have witnesses. Judges were to investigate the testimony carefully rather than pressure the accused into providing evidence against themselves. So listen, you couldn't send somebody to the cross or to death row or to whatever we would call it back then, right? Without corroborating witnesses whose testimony agreed before a guilty verdict could be reached. So when Jesus says, "Why are you asking me?" ask those who heard me. He is literally saying, if you believe I have taught something worthy of condemnation, then produce the witnesses. Where are they at? Right? They know what I've taught. I've been in the synagogues. I've been in the temple. I've taught publicly. I'm not leading some secretive community of rioters, right? This is not what Jesus was doing. He's saying, look, let them testify. Examine their evidence. Conduct this hearing according to the law you claim to uphold. Now, does Jesus know that they're not going to do that? Of course he does, right? But what he's doing is he's showing us the irony of the fact these are the Pharisees and the high priests and the Sadducees and the leaders who claim to love the law, right? To uphold the law. And yet here they're doing it very secretively. They're doing it very not the way that it was supposed to be. Jesus is literally defending justice. He never defends himself. He doesn't say, I'm innocent. I haven't done what y'all are accusing me of. He is defending justice. Notice, he never says I'm innocent. He is appealing to justice. That is significant. He's not trying to escape what's going to happen. If you go back to the garden, he's already accepted what's going to happen, right? What does he say? Father, if there's any other way, but not my will, but your will be done, right? And so he's already accepted the Father's cup. We talked about what that cup means, right? The cup of suffering. He's already accepted, I'm going to go to the cross. This is how I'm going to die. But his concern is that those who are judging him are violating the very law that they claim to defend. I think that still goes on today, right? We have preachers and leaders. We went to the pool yesterday and somehow we got talking about the government in cases like it's corrupt, right? From beginning to the end. So the very people who enforce the laws to us very often are corrupt themselves, right? And so they're not defending. And so that's what Jesus is pointing out here. He's showing us, listen, look at the hypocrisy of the fact that you are defending the law, but yet you're going to crucify me. I haven't done anything wrong, right? Even in his own trial, Jesus upholds God's standard of righteousness. Listen, that's the irony again. These religious leaders prided themselves on being guardians of the law of Moses. They loved the law of Moses, right? They knew it by heart. And yet they are ignoring the requirement for witnesses. They only want evidence that supports a verdict that they have already decided. They allow violence, listen, against an unconvicted man. Jesus is not convicted at this point, right? He's just being brought before them for questioning, and they begin to beat him, right? They want to slap him. This is how it starts. The supposed defenders of justice become its violators. Meanwhile, Jesus, the one they accuse of being a lawbreaker, is the only person in the room insisting that the law be honored, right? So they're saying, you're breaking the law, and Jesus is saying, no, actually, I need y'all to uphold the law, right? So he demonstrates truth and justice belong together. This is what he said. If I said anything wrong, testify to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? Listen, this is revealing God's character. God is not threatened by honest examination, right? Because what is Jesus saying? He's like, show me the truth, right? Bring witnesses to testify of the truth. Truth welcomes investigation because it has nothing to hide, right? Jesus is saying, look, I haven't done anything wrong. So bring the witnesses, bring the people, right? That's why it's important that we live our lives in truth and honesty, right? Because truth welcomes investigation. You'll say, look, I haven't done anything. Now, in our court system, I watch too much Dateline. That can go the other way. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes truth doesn't win. And that's because we live in a corrupt society again, right? But even while facing the cross, Jesus remains committed to righteousness, fairness, and truth. So these are who God, this is who God is, right? He is truth. He is righteousness. He is justice. And so even while Jesus is facing the cross, he's still demanding those things be the qualities that ultimately reflect the heart of God himself. Now, if you'll notice throughout the book of John, we've talked about how John continuously contrasts the light and the darkness, right? He'll talk about, that God is light, I'm the light of the world is darkness. Jesus says, I have spoken openly. Now contrast that with his enemies or the religious people who have brought him. They've dragged him out in the middle of the night, right? So there are no witnesses. That's why they did it at the time they did it, because everybody's asleep, right? Everybody's in the bed. And so Jesus taught publicly in the synagogues and the temple, and the religious leaders are plotting in the darkness. John has repeatedly contrasted light and darkness, and now it is literally reaching into the courtroom where Jesus is standing, right? Because he has done everything in the light. He's saying, look, I did everything openly for everybody to hear what I have to say, but now we're in this dark midnight courtroom, right, where Jesus is being questioned. Now we know that Jesus often, so I wanted to bring this up because he's saying, I taught everything publicly. Now, we know Jesus often explained his teachings to his disciples privately, right? Often because they didn't get it, right? Jesus taught in parables, so they would come back and be like, what do you mean by this, right? What did this mean? Jesus is not saying I didn't spend private time with my disciples. What he's saying is, I've never been the leader of a secret movement or a hidden conspiracy. What I taught publicly is what I taught privately. Like, I was the same person. What they saw is who I am, right? So Jesus's message was public and it was available to everyone. What Nicodemus, right? That's the story where Nicodemus comes to him in the middle of the night. Jesus didn't teach anything there that he wasn't teaching publicly to his followers, right? Everything necessary to understand his mission had been proclaimed openly. That's why they hated him. They knew what he had proclaimed, right? They knew what he had been teaching. That's why they didn't like him. Verse 22, it says, then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. Is that the way to answer the high priest, he demanded. Now, I told you last week, you have to go to some of the other gospels to realize that Peter is witnessing this. While he's denying Jesus, he's seeing Jesus get slapped across the face, right? One of the temple officers strikes Jesus. This fulfills Isaiah's picture of a suffering servant. Now, if you go back to Isaiah 50, verse 6, it says, I offered my back to those who beat me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mockery and spitting. What is that? That is a prophecy thousands of years before Jesus about Jesus, right? It's about the Messiah. And this moment to me is very brief, the slap, but I think it's packed with a lot of theology. It's very significant. One, because it reveals that humanity is rejecting God. And it's the beginning of what is going to happen to Jesus, right? The slap is just kind of the introduction to what he's going to go through. He is calmly calling for lawful witnesses, and one of the temple officers responds not with evidence. So basically when Jesus says, produce your evidence, they don't have any. So what do they respond with? They respond with violence. So they smack him across the face and is like, is that any way to talk to a temple guard? The slap is significant because it shows that his opponents have ran out of arguments. They don't have any words. Have you ever been in this place? Right. The world reacts with violence very often when it doesn't have an answer to the truth, right? Have you ever been in I don't want to call it an argument, a discussion, a disagreement with someone who is not of the faith, right? You're discussing God, you're discussing things, and when they run out of arguments, what do? They get angry, right? And they start responding. I remember I was in a thing one time with a guy, and he was calling God my sugar daddy in the sky, and like all of this stuff was going on, and then he just started name calling, and I was like, look, if you can't have a legitimate discussion without just name calling and being rude, right, then we're not going to do this. But that's very often how the world reacts because they don't have an argument, right? They don't have legitimate words, so they just react with violence. When they cannot answer his words, they strike his face. This is a pattern throughout Scripture. When hearts become hardened, listen, truth is often met with hostility. What does Jesus tell the disciples as they go out? He's like, be prepared. If they hated you, they're going to hate me, right? He's saying, prepare yourself for being met with hostility. Christ appeals to truth and justice, and his opponents had no answer except violence. This is often the world's response when it cannot refute the truth of God, when it doesn't have a legitimate argument, when it doesn't have anything else to say, it's just going to respond with anger, violence, right? Hostility. Isaiah tells us that Jesus would willingly endure humiliation, listen, without resisting because he trusted God to vindicate him. Why was Jesus willing to just take all this, right? Let's be real. Most people, you slap me across the face, I'm not just going to calmly, right? We have a reaction, right? There's a visceral reaction to being slapped. You know, I tell people, I did it to Kason a couple of times. He hated that more than anything else, right? We don't like somebody coming at our face, right? Our humanity demands a response to that, right? But Jesus remains calm, right? He doesn't react. Another irony that John wants us to see in John 1:3, he told us all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Now, who was John talking about in John 1? He's talking about Jesus, right? In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God, he was in the beginning with God. And then in verse 3, he says, all things were made through him. Who? Through Jesus. And without him was not anything made that was made. That means the man that is slapping Jesus's face is made because Jesus allowed him to be born, right? God gave him the very life that he has, and he's using it to slap the Son of God, right? The one being struck is the Creator. The hands that fashioned the universe are being struck by one of the hands that they formed, right? He created this man, and yet he's allowing him. This is one of the greatest ironies of the Passion narrative, that the Creator willingly submits to the violence of his creation. When we say that Jesus left glory, right, that he condescended to become one of us, he literally gave up. He created everything, and now he's saying, I'm going to allow the creation to be violent against me, right? That doesn't make any sense to us, right? Listen, the officer, now let's just talk about it from the legality point again for a minute. He had no legal authority to strike Jesus. Jesus had done nothing wrong, right? The slap demonstrates that this whole trial is a sham from the beginning, right? They had no intention of, they didn't really want to hear Jesus' side of the story. They didn't care what Jesus had to say, right? J.C. Ryle says that Christ gives believers a perfect example, and I think this is funny that this came up in my commentary after what else has been in the news lately, but Christ gives believers a perfect example of how to respond when you have been wronged. Not with revenge, but with truth and self-control, right? We as believers are supposed to be like Christ. I don't know where we lost that in the church. It's been lost in the church that we're supposed to look like Jesus. I don't know, but that's a commentator. That's not me. J.C. Ryle says, Christ gives believers a perfect example of how to respond when you have been wronged, not with revenge, but with truth and self-control. Listen, we're supposed to imitate Christ. That's who we're supposed to look like. It's easy to mistake Jesus' silence for weakness. Listen, it takes a strong man to go through what Jesus went through. It's not weakness. It is actually the supreme strength, right? To be able to go through what he's going through. He had already declared in the garden that he's like, I could call 10,000 angels down. I don't need you cutting off ears, Peter. I don't need you rescuing me. I've already decided, right? The slap only happens because Jesus permits it. Right? He knows. He knew what was going to happen. His restraint is not the absence of power. It is power under control. And that's what's wrong with our government, and that's what's wrong with people, is power corrupts. Power did not corrupt Jesus, right? He was man, fully God, had full power to do whatever he wanted to do, but he controlled it, right? It was power under perfect control in obedience to the Father's will. He's like, I'm going to do whatever God has asked of me to do. The slap is just a foreshadow, I said this already, of what is about to happen at the cross. It's going to get much worse, right? It's going to get much harder than this. But humanity responds to God's perfect love with rejection. The slap is it's a symbol of, we're rejecting everything that you've said, everything that you've taught, everything that you are, we're rejecting that. And Jesus responds to that rejection and that violence with love. I mean, we can go there, we're going to get there, but on the cross, he looks at them and says, Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they're doing, right? They don't understand. Throughout John's gospel, Jesus is the revelation of God's truth. If you're looking for truth, look at Jesus, right? And the slap symbolizes that the world is rejecting that truth, right? Jesus offers truth, the world offers violence. Jesus answers violence with truth and love. So Jesus presents them with his truth, they reject it with violence, and Jesus' answer to that violence is truth and love. He doesn't change who he is, right? He doesn't become like them. He stays who he is. Now let's read verse 23 and 24 for just a minute. It says, Jesus replied, "If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me?" Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. So we've talked about Annas and Caiaphas, and I'm not going to teach that again. So Annas is just kind of a figurehead. He's not really the high priest anymore, but he obviously still holds a lot of power. He's Caiaphas' father-in-law. Caiaphas is actually the high priest. And so at this point, Annas is like, I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to send him to Caiaphas, right? Because he was the actual legal authority at the time. John gives us very little detail about the trial before Caiaphas. If you want detail about that, go read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they give you more detail, okay? John just kind of skips and makes the move quickly toward the Roman trial before Pontius Pilate, okay? His emphasis is less on the Jewish proceedings and more on Jesus as the king who will stand before the representative of Rome. Now, again, why is that? Possibly because John knew. We've already read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? I don't need to recap everything that they've given you, so I'm going to focus more on this. So verse 25, I said we're not going to talk about Peter a lot, but we're going to read these verses because they're in order. It says, "Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again," so this is the second time, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. Now, again, go read the other Gospels, and there's a lot more going on here, right? Like Peter and Jesus are making eye contact. Peter goes out and weeps, right? Because he realizes that what Jesus had told him has come to pass. He's denied Jesus 3 times. The rooster has crowed. Verse 28, it says, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. We're talking about ironies. You're literally plotting to kill an innocent man, but you won't go inside a Gentile's house because you won't be able to eat the Passover dinner. It may be one of the sharpest ironies in John chapter 18, right? The religious leaders are concerned about ceremonial purity, right? And yet, at that very moment, they are plotting murder, okay? They refuse to enter a Gentile's residence while delivering God's Son to be crucified. John is exposing the difference, listen, between external religion and true righteousness. He's showing us, look, they looked the part. They did all the right things, right? They kept all of the rules and did all of the things. Jesus had taught this very thing in Mark 7 when he said it is what comes out of the heart that defiles a person far more than ceremonial contact, right? What is in us is what defiles us. It's not necessarily what we're touching, right? Their priorities are tragically inverted. They fear ritual uncleanness, but they do not fear innocent blood. They don't fear the repercussions of not following the law when it comes to Jesus, right? So what did being defiled mean to them? So entering the residence of a Gentile would make them ceremonially unclean. How many of you have watched The Chosen? Right? So if they become ceremonial unclean, there's certain things they can't do for days, right? They can't go certain places, they can't touch certain things. And so especially during Passover, this is significant, right? Because they all wanted to participate in Passover. But how hypocritical, right? The hypocrisy. They're meticulous about ceremonial regulations while violating the far greater commands of justice, mercy, and truth. If you read the Old Testament and all you see is that God has given them a bunch of rules, you've missed the whole point. Because that's not really the whole point. The Old Testament is very concerned about truth. It's very concerned about righteousness. It's very concerned about justice. God makes provisions for widows and orphans and the unclean, right? And listen, the Old Testament is hard. I ain't gonna lie. We were talking about the other day. I read some stuff and I'm like, geez, what is this? Like what, right? But God had to deal with his people where they were, right? In the communities they lived in, right? In the midst of the pagan cultures that they lived in. And he created these laws and these things, but it was always about truth, justice, and mercy, right? That is who God was. And so they're concerned about this ceremony, but they're not concerned about justice. They're not concerned about truth. They're not concerned about mercy. Listen, and I'm not even judging them because we're the same way. How often will we come in here and feel good because we did our Sunday thing, we checked off the box of church, we right, and then we judge those who we feel aren't living up to our standards, right? And we have no mercy, we have no compassion, right? Listen, we've got to be, Jesus had condemned this kind of religion in Matthew 23. This is what Jesus said. He said, you strain out a gnat, but you're swallowing a camel. You're straining out a little gnat. Now, there's like a whole thing, there's a whole teaching about this, and I didn't make all the notes about it, but the oil would get gnats in it, right? And so they would have to skim it so they could get all the gnats out. He's like, you're doing that. You're straining out the gnats, but you're swallowing a whole camel, right? You're worried about the little bitty things, but you have no justice. You have no mercy, right? And so listen, this chapter is full of irony. It's full of contrast. We see Jesus is faithful, Peter fails. I told you, the whole point of pointing out that Peter fails is not so we can condemn Peter. No. It's so we can see how gracious God is, right? That he was so gracious to Peter, right? That Peter didn't deserve what the Lord offered him, but the Lord offered it to him anyway, right? And loved him and forgave him. Jesus is speaking truth. Everybody else is lying. Peter's lying. Do you know? Are you with him? No, I'm not with him. No, I'm not with him. No, I'm not with him, right? Everybody's lying. Jesus is telling the truth. It doesn't matter, right? Jesus is speaking justice. Listen, the court, they don't care about justice. They don't care about the truth coming out. Jesus is declared worthy of death, yet he's truly innocent, right? The religious leaders appear clean, but obviously they're morally defiled, right? They're not clean. Jesus put it this way, your whitewashed tombs, pretty on the outside, dead men's bones on the inside, right? Ugly. And so, listen, the one who appears condemned, he's actually the only righteous one here. Right. He's the only righteous judge. John's irony is relentless. I want you to go back and read John 18 and just think about the ironies that he's presenting over and over. Those who are obsessed with remaining ceremonial clean become guilty of the greatest moral impurity imaginable, right? They're so concerned about looking the part. I think we do this in the church, right? We're so concerned with looking the part that we just forget the real stuff that matters. We don't deal with the real stuff, right? We don't deal with those things on the inside that nobody sees, right? They avoid entering a Gentile governor's house so they can eat the Passover dinner, and yet they are handing over the true Passover lamb to be slain. Listen, Jesus is the Passover lamb. He is the one that they've been waiting for, right? He's the one. Passover was always pointing ahead, right? Isaiah prophesied. All of these prophecies are about Jesus. It's about the Passover lamb, and they're passing him over. I kind of stopped there. Does anybody want to share anything before we move forward? We're gonna read the rest of John, and let's see. I do have some notes, but all right, let's see. John, verse 28. It says, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, what is your charge against this man? We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal, they retorted. Then take him away and judge him by your own law, Pilate told him. Pilate's like, okay, well, if he's a criminal, then y'all deal with him. Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. There's the whole thing, okay? They want Jesus dead, right? They don't want him just thrown in jail. They want him dead. The Jewish leaders replied, this fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die. Then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. Are you the king of the Jews? He asked them. Jesus replied, is this your own question, or did others tell you about me? Am I a Jew? Pilate retorted. Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for trial. Why? What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate says, so you are a king? Jesus responded, you say I am a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. What is truth? Pilate asked. Then he went out again to the people and told them, he is not guilty of any crime. But you have a custom of asking me to release one prisoner each year at Passover. Would you like me to release the king of the Jews? But they shouted back, no, not this man. We want Barabbas. Barabbas was a revolutionary. Let's talk about Pilate for just a minute, and we'll do these verses next week. But I did have some notes. Let me see if I can find them on my phone about Pilate. So if you've seen The Chosen, his character's interesting. His character's interesting little dude on The Chosen. Let's see. If I can find them. Says Pontius Pilate is one of the most significant figures in the Passion narrative because he represents the authority of the Roman Empire. So literally, Pilate comes on the scene to represent Rome and its power, right? It had power over the Jews. So I think we talked about this earlier in John, but basically Rome at this time kind of allowed the Jews to do their own thing. So they could do their sacrifices, they could do their stuff, as long as there wasn't uprising, right? As long as they paid their taxes, and as long as they didn't revolt, they were fine. Now, it mentions Barabbas being a revolutionary at the end, right? What was he a revolutionary against? He was a revolutionary against Rome, right? And so Pilate comes in to represent that authority. And although he repeatedly concludes that Jesus is innocent, he ultimately authorizes the crucifixion. Why? Because he was afraid of the people. So again, I said The Chosen kind of portrays this, that he's a people pleaser, right? He wants his job. He wants his cushy job. He doesn't want to be kicked out of what he's doing. And so he doesn't want an uprising. He doesn't want a revolt from the people. And so he's going to do whatever it takes. Some historical things about Pilate. He served as Roman governor or prefect of Judea from approximately AD 26 to 36, so for about 10 years. He was appointed by Tiberius. His official residence was in Caesarea Maritima, but he came to Jerusalem during major festivals like Passover because the city swelled with pilgrims and was prone to unrest. So if you watch The Chosen, again, he comes into the city in Jerusalem during Passover because they want to keep the people in line, right? Because the people would come from all of their homes, right? They would travel for Passover to the temple, and so he would come and he would live there during this time. His primary responsibilities were collecting taxes, maintaining order, and administering Roman justice. Ancient writers portray Pilate as capable but harsh. The Jewish historian Josephus and the philosopher Philo of Alexandria describe him as stubborn, insensitive to Jewish customs, and willing to use force to suppress opposition. Several incidents had already damaged his relationship with the Jewish leaders. So bringing Roman military standards, bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem, he had used temple funds to build an aqueduct. That's actually in The Chosen too. They actually build this water thing, right? And then violently suppressing protests. By the time Jesus stood before him, Pilate was in a politically delicate position. So he's wanting to keep the peace at this point because he has done things, right, that he's afraid. So why did they bring Jesus to Pilate? The Sanhedrin could have condemned Jesus for blasphemy according to their understanding of Jewish law, but they generally could not carry out a Roman execution without Roman approval. So the Sanhedrin could have said Jesus needs to die because he's blasphemed God, right? But they couldn't legally put him on a cross. They needed Rome to do that. So they changed the emphasis of the charges. Before the Jewish leaders, Jesus was accused of blasphemy, but before Pilate, he was presented as a political threat. Okay, so he's going to cause an uprising. He's got all these followers that are following him because he's doing all of these miracles. A man claiming to be King of the Jews. So why does Pilate keep bringing up, are you a king? Because if he thought he was a king, then he would try to overthrow Rome, right? So they're making it political at this point. They're interpreting it as rebellion against Rome if he's calling himself a king. Pilate's dilemma. Pilate quickly realized Jesus was not leading an armed revolt. He's like, this man ain't leading the army, right? I'm sure Pilate had seen revolutionaries, right? He had witnessed Barabbas. He knew what a revolutionary looked like, and he's looking at Jesus and he's like, I don't think this is it, right? So he goes back out to the people and says that. He declares that he finds no guilt in Jesus. Yet he faces two competing pressures. Justice, Jesus is innocent, and politics, right? Releasing someone accused of claiming to be king during Passover could provoke unrest and lead to complaints reaching Caesar. Pilate ultimately chooses political security over justice, right? Now, what does he do? He washes his hands. We know that, right? He's like, later, he's like, I'm going to wash my hands. This is not me. Y'all made this choice. John gives Pilate more dialogue with Jesus than any other gospel. Their conversation centers on, again, truth is coming up, right? Truth is all throughout this chapter, right? Kingship, authority, and then Jesus begins to talk about his kingdom, right? The origin of his kingdom. One of the most famous exchanges is, he says, what is truth? Because Jesus looks at him. Let's read it again. I think I shut it down. It says, are you a king? And then in verse 38, he says, what is truth? Pilate asked. Because Jesus has said, you say I'm a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is true. So he's talking about truth. And then Pilate to me, that's kind of like a sarcastic, like, well, what is truth? Right? Like, who knows what truth is? That's a very big conversation in our world today, right? What is truth? Right? Who is right? And we all know, right, that Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And so Jesus is truth, and that's literally what he's declaring here. But Pilate's kind of going, man, I feel like this is that thing that everybody still says today. Well, what's true for you may not be true for me, right? I feel like Pilate's saying, well, what's your truth? That's not my truth, right? Ironically, Pilate asked the question while standing face to face with the one who had earlier declared, I am the truth, right? And so John portrays Pilate as a man caught between conviction and compromise, right? He recognizes Jesus' innocence, but he lacks the courage to act on what he knows is right. How often do we do that, right? As people, right? We have conviction, we have something that we know we're supposed to do, but we will compromise, right? Because of pressures from outside, right? Pressures from the things going on around us. For many years, some questioned whether Pilate was actually a historical figure. Y'all know I like giving some of this little like archaeological stuff. That changed in 1961 with the discovery of the Pilate stone at Caesarea Maritima. The inscription bears his name and title, proving direct archaeological confirmation that Pontius Pilate served as prefect of Judea. John sets Pilate in deliberate contrast with Jesus. Listen, Pilate is supposed to be the main authority, right? He's the ruler of Rome, right? At this place where they are. He appears to have authority, but he's really just constrained by fear, right? He's really going to move according to what the people are saying. Jesus appears powerless, listen, but is completely in control of the situation, right? He knows exactly what is going to happen. Pilate sits on the judgment seat, but Jesus is the true judge of all humanity. Can you imagine when Pilate stands, I don't know how that works, stands before Jesus, right? We're all going to be judged, right? We're all going to stand before, what is that exchange like, right? Do y'all think about these things? Am I the only person that thinks these things, right? Like Pilate think about all the people who condemned Jesus and the ones who tortured him on the cross. They got to stand before him one day as King of Kings, right? Lord of Lords. It's fascinating.
I thought about the one that slammed him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, he's going to stand before him.
As Jesus tells Pilate in John 19:11, we're not here yet. Jesus literally looks at Pilate and says, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. He's like, you only have any authority because God gave it to you. Listen, John's message is clear. Pilate may pronounce the earthly sentence, but the true authority belongs to Jesus.
Yes.
Even the Roman governor is acting within the sovereign plan of God, and we all know that. Listen, I don't know how true all this is, but apparently there's like anti-Semitism for a lot of times because they're like the Jews killed Jesus. Listen, nobody killed Jesus. Jesus willingly gave himself. There had to be a plan, right? There had to be a way that it happened. Now, I don't understand. God's ways are higher than my ways. His thoughts are higher than my thoughts, right? Have you ever thought, like, what if Jesus had been born in a different time? Do y'all think about these weird things like me? Like, what if he had been born in a time with, I don't know, social media or all of the things, like, right? I feel like Jesus had to come at the time he came to fulfill the purposes, right, of what he was going to do. Listen, it was all perfectly planned out by the Father. And Jesus is telling them that. Everybody that he stands before, he's like, look, I mean, y'all don't really have any authority over me, right? I'm willingly laying down my life. I'm willingly giving myself. How awesome is that for us? Does anybody want to share anything before we close? I'll probably touch on a little bit of the end of chapter 18 next week, and then we'll see if we move into 19. All right.
All right.
Pray we have a baby this week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yay. I hope so. I was